very much, Kathleen.
So what's it all about?
I mean, I think I should preface this by saying that we have one expert and friend of Burroughs here, and an enthusiast who's not so much of an expert, but I think what we want to talk about are things that don't often get talked about in the way that we're going to, I hope. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's our intention. And I think first of all, to think, Miles, to just if you can think about where this work actually came from. Because, in 1982, when he started doing this, he'd not long left New York. Not long left New York and had moved, or was moving to Kansas. And, Burroughs is known as a writer rather than an artist, but even then, this was still very much a private activity, wasn't it?
Yeah, to give the background on his painting, when he got to Kansas I forget now quite exactly what the dates were, but he began going shooting a lot with friends. One thing he couldn't do in New York very easily, and so he went out to outside the city limits of Lawrence, Kansas. A friend of his had a little shooting range, and one day he was shooting at a target and went up to inspect what was left of it, and there were lots of splinters of different layers of wood, and he had the same kind of epiphany that Brian Geisen had when he was cutting a mount for a picture and basically discovered cut-ups. Burroughs exactly had the same thing. He suddenly looked at it and said, "This is art," basically, and it was one of those kind of paintings. Although, of course, the first one didn't have any painting on it as well. It was just simply an object which he identified as art, and then almost immediately began to work on by attaching bits of collage, painting some of the surface. First of all, I think that he began by hanging cans of paint in front of the piece of wood and then shooting at it. At first, he just fired away at it, but of course that just made holes and the paint just dribbled out. So then he realized high-pressure spray cans is what you need, because they really exploded and went everywhere. And then the whole point was he then had an object that was new in the world, really, and he could approach them in the same way that he used to approach Brian Geisen's pictures, which is to say, usually with the aid of a fair amount of hashish. He would inspect them very, very carefully, maybe with a magnifying glass, and within the paintings he would find doorways, gateways into I suppose sort of an enhanced vision, really, a new, a much more intense way of looking at the world, and that's really. So he was producing gateways, really. He wasn't thinking of it in formal compositional sort of Renaissance terms at all. They were almost working models for him to find new characters, to change his consciousness by some little jolt.
And these were, these gateways were both a gateway in and a gateway out. So they were sort of, if you like, entry wounds and exit wounds. And I think looking at the back of that particular shot piece is very much, captures that feeling of the early shot pieces made shooting at bits of plywood. And you look at the back, and you have this other landscape, and it's a landscape of buildings, maybe a landscape of people. Mm-hmm. It's something that is very much akin to the desert landscapes of Brian Geisen. But again, this is still very private, because looking at a lot of this work, most of it dates from 88, 89 and after, rather than, so the last years of Burroughs' life. The shot pieces occupy a very small part of that very extreme period of a couple of years, and it was he saw them, his friends, his associates saw them, but they weren't really seen publicly. And why was that?
Not,
Because
well,
I
not
think
until Brian Garson died, because although he collaborated enormously with Brian in terms of literature, I mean, they published, I guess, 5 books together in some form or another. He knew that Brian would definitely feel threatened if Bill started to have an art career as well, because Garson's identity was very much more as a fine artist. Although it didn't take very long, really, until Burroughs stopped just using them for his personal creative thought and began to use more formal a more formal approach to the art in terms of collage, use of colour, composition and things like that. Basically, he was, I mean, it's just something people have always done. I mean, if you go back to Leonardo da Vinci, let's say, in the 1490s, he would advise his the apprentices and people in his studio to look at ashes and mud and stained walls. And within that, you would find villages and landscapes and battle scenes and all of that. I mean, so people have often done that. You create a situation or identify a visual situation and then look into it, and it enables you to make that little jolt, which takes you into a deeper visual understanding of what's there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, the power of a lot of these works are almost the power of something made with your eyes shut.
Well, Bill did actually do paintings with his eyes shut, because that was a bit later, 88, 89, I guess. But and you couldn't, I mean, he knew what he was doing, because the way he saw it, he had some kind of vague idea, but he would let his hand get on with it, basically. The less control, the better. Because, as he said, he had no formal art training. You know, the way he put it to me once was that he couldn't even draw a chair. You know, he wouldn't even look. You know, nobody would even recognise it. It looked like a 4-year-old's drawing. But nonetheless, he was creating something new on Earth, as it were, and using that as a way into a greater visual understanding. I mean, he'd always worked like that. You see, back in 1960, for instance, when he moved to Britain to be with Ian Somerville, because Ian had 1 year left at Cambridge. And so Bill spent his time either in London or in Cambridge, in fact. And one of the things he would do then to keep his sense of place, I guess his grounding, was he would go on colour walks. You know, one day he would go out and just look for anything coloured yellow, and then the next day it would be blue, you know, or whatever, and keep everything fresh. And then when he was living in London at Duke Street, St James, if he had any film left in his camera at the end of each roll, he would always take pictures out of the window, and endlessly, I mean, dozens and dozens of them, so that something as everyday and mundane as that didn't just become forgotten. He always wanted to situate himself right here and now, and that would help, because he would then look at the picture, look at the window, you know, typical Burroughs stuff.
I mean, in one sense, I mean, these are works created through and as a mediumistic medium. You know, it can be a mediumistic medium. It's something where the artist is led as much as the artist is leading something. You know, it's like it's a sense of a voyage of discovery, in a way. And part of that is caused through the adoption of chance. Yeah. And I think the sense of chance, you know, it situates him within a long history of artists in the 20th century who had used chance as the basis of their work. But you know, absolutely, that's part and parcel of the adoption of cut-ups earlier, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what I'm really intrigued by here is the relationship here between Burroughs as a writer and Burroughs as an artist, and what the art tells us, or what use it had for his writing. Because certainly, thinking about his use of photography and scrapbooks back in the early 60s, he was creating a visual set of images that were like a set for the books, and a set for different identities and places where certain routines could take place, where here I think something else is going on. And I just, yeah.
Well, like you say, I mean, there's a backstory to it. I mean, probably beginning in about 1958, 59, when he was doing the glyph drawings, that one of which appeared on the cover of Naked Lunch, the Naked Lunch, the original Paris edition in 1959. And that was basically very much because he was under the influence of Brian Gysin. But then the same year, in fact, or actually the year before, he met Henri Michaud and became very friendly with him and got to know his masculine drawings, of which, in fact, there's a show on at the Courtauld right now of Michaud's masculine drawings, which is well worth a look at. They provide magnifying glasses as well, which is very useful. You know. So, since they, Henri used to really get into it, you get smaller and smaller and smaller, and so did Burroughs, of course. And then also through Brian, Bill saw the work of Mark Tobey. Again, lots of very small.
Yes.
I guess there's not really a good example here, but Burroughs did something fairly similar sometimes, and. I've sort of forgotten where I'm leading to here. In the end, we reach pictures where the whole point of them was to investigate and see what he could find in the actual work. And then when he found it, he would often find faces or events. He had a friend called John Bloom, is it? Honey? Yeah. Who was a local photographer he would get him to take photographs of these bits of his paintings and have them blown up to different sizes. And then he would paste them onto but they're not canvases, they're all on board. There's probably one in this room. There's certainly one around the corner anyway. A good example of that. And so it's also a work in progress, really. It doesn't fall within formal art and normal aesthetics of artwork. On the other hand, he saw them as almost like machines. They were designed to give people a jolt and ground them and make them understand. Well, like all of his work. I mean, his basic premise, as Honey said earlier, is to challenge all forms of control and challenge absolutely everything. Your identity, as your nationality, your sex, your political beliefs. And once you bring it into consciousness, you can evaluate it, and if you still like it, fine. But at least it's a conscious decision. And all of his work is kind of like that in a way. It's the Naked Lunch, after all, is to see what's on the end of the fork, so these are all part of a huge mass of work, which is, cut-ups, poetry. He wrote the text of an opera. I mean, or the lyrics anyway. I mean, on and on and on. I mean, it's all the same project in a way. It's a bit like Ezra Pound's cantos, and you take it on into a much more postmodernist sort of explosion.
But I mean, thinking about Burroughs' public persona as an artist rather than just as a writer, that really only happened right at the end of his life, after Gysin had died and after public exhibitions of paintings like the paintings that are gathered here. And that, in a sense, allied him with a certain generation of art that seems in many respects to be quite different from the way in which, say, I would have positioned him, as I do position him as an artist working in the late 50s and early 60s. There's a very particular different use being made of the work. I think I primarily there's a difference between a work made that invests an awful lot in the object nature of the work and work that doesn't. And I would say this is work that sort of allies itself very much with an 80s late 70s, early 80s kind of sensibility of neo-expressionism and all of that. And the artists that Burroughs knew at that time, like Jean-Michel Basquiat, like Philip Taff, maybe, I don't know if Richard Longo was known to him then or not.
He
but
knew
those sorts
of work, for instance.
Yeah. Is very different from the way in which the visual imagery that he used in the early 60s allies him to a very different kind of sensibility, which is about moving away from the object, thinking about time rather than space, rather than the object. And in the way that cut-ups are very much involved with dislocation of narrative flows, dislocations of and disruption of control, as you put it. You know, it's very, very, very much akin to the way in which artists like John Latham, for instance, were working out ideas of event structure, moving away from things rather than, you know, towards events, and also making work that asks questions about the nature of knowledge and the nature of meaning, which is all here, but in a very different form of ports of entry, if you like, and also the relationship to his own writing is, I feel, quite different. And I don't know if you feel that at all. Do you think there's a kind of a continuum?
I see it much more integrated, really, because these are cut-ups ultimately. You know, I mean, the use of random elements was very, very important to him, just as it was with the different kind of cut-ups. And he extended cut-ups, of course, from just on the page to cut-ups of, first of all, tape recordings, and then later on into film with Anthony Balch. And there was also, you mentioned performance. I mean, he had a number of famous performance events in Paris, you know, in which usually where he became invisible. You know, there's one famous one that happened in the Beat Hotel where he sat behind a sort of Venetian blind that occasionally went up and down, and then a picture of him was being projected onto him. And the whole thing was flickering the whole time, and eventually the light went up and he wasn't there. He managed to crawl away down beneath the screen. And there's a lot of famous ones there. There's one where he was apparently dressed as a hypodermic syringe or something. But that's another matter, I think. But he everything he did was an experiment like that. I mean, it all seems to me to be one huge mass of work, but also partly his identity was always fluid. I think almost everything could be seen, if you wanted to be cynical, almost as play acting. You know, even way back in the 40s, you know, he pretend to be this sort of terrible right-wing, property owner. Just, you know, he would send these vicious letters to Allen Ginsberg. I mean, not vicious, but I mean, describing vicious events, just in order to make Allen, get angry. But it was a send-up, and then he had all these different roles. There were various occasions when they did charades back in the late 40s, early 40s even. When he basically showed that he had about 5 or 6 different personalities, I mean, he really, there were all these different sides of him, which he was prepared to, instead of cover up and try and deal with, he would explore them. On the one hand, he would be an old peasant sitting by the banks of the Yangtze fishing, and then he would suddenly be dressed as a nurse or something, I mean, right across the board. I mean, every single aspect of his personality that he could identify with, he would bring out. And he used his writing to do that, and later on his tape recordings. And because this was his identity, when he got onto something, he really did it. I mean, he would do thousands of cut-ups, an enormous number of tape cut-ins, and then when he began painting, same thing happened. He didn't just paint on card. I mean, he painted the file folders, like the ones there. He painted the waste bin. He painted his tie. He painted the front door. I mean, everything got. That was what he was at that moment. He was a painter.
I mean, I think one of the things that I've always found consistently about Burroughs and has always led me on and totally fascinated me is that I never really approached him as a writer at all. I always kind of approached him as an artist, and an artist who worked, sort of. I think one of the great early early proponents of what came to be called intermedia. It's as an artist, as you
said, scrapbooks.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the scrapbooks, the recordings, photography, painting, but also performance. I mean, you mentioned performances, impromptu performances at the Beat Hotel. He also took part in performances with Brian Geisen at the ICA, and in Paris as well.
Yeah, the American Centre in Paris.
As part of the Domaine Poétique, and I think it's those in a way, I feel it's not that all of that activity provides setting for his writing, which of course they do, and there's sort of a parallel research material kind of approach, but actually not. It wasn't a preamble, it was kind of the thing. And it's not something separate in a way, and I think that is the consistency carrying on to what is a very different approach to making art. It's very much more traditional, obviously. It's like painting on rather than all these other
all
activities.
The scrapbooks and stuff were very private works. They were never intended to sell or anything. I mean, he still saw himself as a writer, and the scrapbooks led him to develop new characters, and particularly the 3-column work that he would do, where the 3 texts would be running next to each other, and as he read down, the eye would also subconsciously read what was on either side, and then he started to put pictures in there so that there was a visual element. And he would get new situations, new characters and everything for his writing. And then at the same time he was working with photography, doing the same thing. He would take there's a place called Prince's Place just directly across from where he lived on Duke Street, St James. And I've got about 15 photographs he took of it. I mean, and it's just a boring little alley with nothing in it at all. It's just a dead end. But out of that, he once told me that he got several pages of material. I mean, God knows what happened to it. It's certainly not identifiable in any of his books. But that was how he worked. I mean, it was massive overwork. I mean, just to get 1 or 2 pages, I mean, he did an enormous amount of research, as it were. Yeah. And
well, it's like you're trying to root everything in a particular place. It's like Interzone is a particular place.
Well, then of course, you get the scrapbooks, which are is where he starts to become visually more aware and put colour washes over sections of the pages and go back to previous pages and add things on, photographs or news clippings or whatever. And so in the end, you have this incredible composite of information when you flip through the scrapbooks like that, and then they lead on ultimately to his sort of rediscovery of visual art with the shotgun work. And he was also broke at the time, and it wasn't too long before he realized, that maybe he could make some money out of this, because things were getting a bit tough out in Kansas. So after Brian died, he did feel that maybe he could have a show. I don't know the background to the show. Maybe Raymond does. Somebody. It was Shafazi here first, wasn't it? And then here. Yeah. So, and then of course, once he's working within the more formal constraints of the art business, and he had to present them in a more accessible way. And here we are.
Although, I mean, to a very strong degree. You say that the early work, the photographic work, the scrapbook work, was private, and it was private, but it also formed a visual framing for a lot of the way his writing was presented then, whether or not it's, infinity photographs on the cover of early editions of.
Well, then we can. That's another very complicated area. His collaborations, of course, with Bukowski and then Ian Somerville, and then later with Anthony Bosch and others. He loved that kind of collaborative work.
Yeah. But I mean, collaboration, in a way, again, it is at the root of his work. It's at the root of cut-ups. Cut-ups is always going to be a collaboration, and a collaboration with chance, in the way that these paintings here are themselves a collaboration with the kind of process. It's like he's being led in, and he's sort of both an author and also a subject, and also one of many subjects. I mean, it's like, there are many Burroughs. There isn't one I in terms of his own writing, and also in the way he represented himself or represented figures that could be him or could be other people. There's a lot of masks, I think, in his work. And it's like masks, overlays, stencils. I mean, you think about what how the grid is seen as very much a constraining device within modernism, but is also multiple points of entry. It's that sense of.
And he very much used the grid.
I mean, I'm looking at the moment at one of the stencil works where he takes a metal grill or something which provides these punctuation points, which again are very much like the shot works. I think what I'm trying to say is, on the one hand, there are these huge disjunctions between an approach that he made in his visual work in the 50s and 60s to a way of working which seems very traditional, seems very much of the moment, connecting with, as it were, the zeitgeist in the late 70s and early 80s.
Yes.
But actually is an approach very much born of an earlier period and earlier sensibility. But also he's an artist that, talking about Burroughs as an artist, which, it's somebody very difficult sometimes to position. And, you've written about this in the past and spoken about it in the past in terms of his connection to, it could be artists who use, shotguns and so forth. Now, that sort of randomness in their work, thinking of Duchamp, thinking of Joseph Cornell, thinking of Niki de Saint-Phal, but it's also...
And all the new realists.
But then also thinking about the nouveau realists like Yves Klein and Tanguy and Armand and so forth. But I actually wondered to what extent he was actually involved with their work and knew their work, or was this a kind of a milieu more than anything else?
I think it's one of those things you can't help be part of art history, no matter how individual you think you are. In 50 years' time, you fit right in there, and he does, of course, by now. And he was aware of Armand, certainly. Niki de Saint-Phal's work he knew. And I think he knew about that, though, because of the fact that she worked with Rauschenberg and, I forget, Rauschenberg's pal.
Jasper Johns.
Jasper Johns, exactly. And they both took turns shooting at her pictures. She got in a sort of celebrity marksman, as it were. So he... well, as soon as he started to, people started to approach him and talk about art, obviously he wanted to learn about it more. But Bill was never a great gallery goer, in my experience anyway. If he went to anywhere, it would be the British Museum and look at anthropological stuff rather than art. Or even, for that matter, architecture. He was always very keen on being right here in the present time. But he didn't really care too much where that was. It could be Tangier or Paris or even Lawrence, Kansas in the end. Although he did say that was pretty boring. But, and the food was terrible.
But I mean, he was a great friend of Francis Bacon's.
Yeah,
I mean,
I wouldn't say great friend, but
they
he
hung out quite a bit. But again, it was more hanging out than how much did he really know of Bacon's work?
Probably not that much.
Yeah,
I would
although
say. But they had other things in common.
Yeah. But I think there was one instance where, and I think it's very much applies to an artist who, like Burroughs, where the work isn't being made according to conventional approaches to, if you like, picture making. And I remember this conversation reported that he had with Bacon, and he asked Bacon, how do you know when something's finished? How do you know when your painting is finished? It's like the finished / unfinished nature of anything that comes out of process, which Burroughs' work does, is always going to be a huge question mark. And I think Bacon said words to the meaning of it's basically relies on that chance brushstroke that locks in the magic, and it's that one thing. It's like a real, it's the success of all this work here is basically in each painting. It is that one thing, that point at which you can find a way into seeing something you've never seen before, seeing something remarkable, being led somewhere else. It's like through the portal. The entry wound isn't enough. You do need the exit wound as well to carry you through.
Yeah, it must have been a problem for him because, like you say, it is process work, and as he had no art training or anything like that, it had to be totally intuitive. And I know that he felt that sometimes he'd spoiled pictures, and presumably some of them are unfinished by the same definition. But usually he managed to pull it off, I think.
And he also knew, there was a point when he started doing the shop paintings and he realised he was onto something, and he kept doing it, and then realised actually that was just a mechanical exercise, and it's time to stop. And
he took it to an extreme, and he had one friend in Kansas whose name I've just forgotten, but
Wayne Probst.
Wayne Probst, who encouraged him very much. And Wayne was a local artist who did amazing stuff. One of my favourite pieces of his was a complete cow skeleton that he crucified and really upset all the local Kansas Christians. But Wayne said, well, if we're going to shoot things, let's do it properly. And he got a cannon, and just blew absolutely everything to pieces. There was nothing much left. I've got a small fragment on one of my shelves.
So they were shooting bowling balls.
Yes, they did. It's classic though. You explore every single angle, and. But ultimately, Bill realised that it was much more satisfactory to use the collage techniques that he'd already been using in his photographic montages and his scrapbooks. And so there was a real continuity, really, between the scrapbook art and the photograph. I think he must have been unique in this respect. He would take a fairly large board and arrange photographs on it and take a picture. Well, he wouldn't take the picture. Ian Somerville usually took the picture. And then he would move them all around a little bit and then take another picture and then move them again. So they weren't collages, they weren't stuck down. But the actual photograph was the artwork. And he may have been a pioneer in that particular tiny little aspect of photography. And but nonetheless, each one was a different consciousness, really, particularly if they were all pictures of his family or pictures of his friends, because they represented each one was a new take on his relatives or his relationships. So it all led via montage and collage and on the scrapbooks to what we now look at as basically fine art formula. The formula.
Do you see a direct relationship between those sorts of assemblages of memory, which is basically what is going on, or part of what's going on in those early montages, with the way in which, with these later paintings, he would sometimes affix photographs or images from magazines.
Oh, yeah.
And they're sort of very, again, kind of very, they're like signposts. Though, you know, it's like there's a fantastic group of three in the other gallery on that wall, which, I mean, make very clear certain connection, very close connection to ecological issues.
Yeah, particularly his lemur interest in it.
Exactly, but is he using the image, the photograph, because there it's a single photographic image placed by and large centrally, as opposed to these assemblages?
Well, that's the same as the scrapbooks. You know, very, very similar to the way he treated things. In his current set of interests would be represented in. Because I don't suppose some of them didn't take very long to do. Right. And I mean, I have seen others that he never ever sent out in public, which were rather more pornographic. And so it was whatever was going through his head, you know. It was a record of his everyday life. It was these were snapshots almost of his consciousness on that particular day. Yeah, which sort of sounds a bit highfalutin, but
diaristic.
I think we can say that. Yeah. Yes, diaristic, very much so. Yeah.
So I mean, you knew Burroughs since the 60s, mid 60s.
Yeah, I met him in 65. I corresponded before that.
You saw the arc of his career as both as writer and artist intertwined. I'm just really fascinated to hear how you position Burroughs as strictly speaking, as an artist, or if you feel you can, sort of, beyond influence, beyond, you know, sort of who influenced him, where he got his references from, but actually, where's he situated?
I find them. I think they work as paintings. I mean, in my living room, I've got a Burroughs painting, and then there's a Brian Geisen print. It's exactly the same size. I'm using exactly the same grid. In fact, a six-panel grid, and I think he just fits right into the history of art at that point. I mean, he's doing that kind of work. You just know that this is a 60s, or 50s, 60s kind of approach to the visual world, and so I think I see his fine art productions, as it were, as separate. But I'm very aware of the scrapbook and particularly the photographic stuff. I mean, and one of his problems, and Geisen's as well, has always been that the problems of mechanical reproduction. You know, he all through the 60s, he and Geisen were doing tremendous amounts of collaboration, with Geisen doing big collages and everything to illustrate the texts, but nobody could afford to print them, so most of those books never got printed. So most people were utterly unaware of that experimental side of both of them. And even now, his photographs are virtually unknown. I mean, there's some in the Tate, thanks to you, and some in the Museum of Modern Art, and some in the LA County Museum, and that's about it. But he was doing some really experimental stuff there, of negatives and reductions, and I mean all kinds of stuff. And then usually getting them printed at the corner store, So as usual, as Bill himself would say, he had all these great experimental plans, but he said that the execution was always sloppy. And so the same could be said about his pictures, his photographs.
I mean the group of photo montages from the early 60s that are in the Tate, I mean, from my perspective, are there for a number of reasons. And one is, yes, how they fit into histories of photography at that time. But I think more fundamentally, how Burroughs, often seen as an American artist, an American writer, actually at a time when he was living between London, Tangier and Paris, was making work that absolutely connected with the countercultural, visual countercultural scenes in London and elsewhere at that time.
Yeah.
And he was absolutely linked through cut-ups, you know, essentially through as it were the school of cut-ups, to artists such as Mark Boyle, Boyle Family, John Latham, Gustav Metzger, and others, and you know, sort of very much through the organ, the mouthpiece of in London at that time of Jeff Nuttall's My Own Mag,
very much so.
Which again, thinking, oh well, Burroughs's visual work was sort of private at that time, but it wasn't, because the cut-up pages that are in My Own Mag are themselves incredibly visual. You know, I mean, the use of the column, the use of 3 columns, the use of the grid, and but also the introduction, certainly in the Dutch Schultz issue of My Own Mag, also of images from scrapbooks and some of the photo montages, including one which is in the Tate. So there's a kind, there is a sense in which the language of cut-ups was delivered very much visually. And I think certainly in terms of the work he was making in the 60s, he was, you know, an absolutely essential figure. You know, it's like the performances at the ICA, the linkage with
and
Gustav.
his connection with pop culture as well. I mean, you know, all the various rock and roll musicians who picked up on him. You know, I mean, he's on the front cover of Sgt. Pepper, for instance. You know, and you know, so he penetrated the pop scene. I think it's called rock by then, actually. Quite early on, actually, you know, and people like David Bowie later on were using cut-ups to write lyrics and so on.
But just in the way that Jeff Nuttall produced My Own Mag as a way to force people to take seriously and understand the mess the world was in. It was very much the same sense in which Burroughs wrote Naked Lunch. You know, it's like you see what's on the fork in front of you, and that was something that is in itself inherently a visual position.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
So I don't know.
Any
Questions? Maybe.
What do you think, honey? Do we need to talk some more, or do you want to open it up a bit?
I'm interested in how you think the continuity of cut-ups translates through to some of the painting works. How the continuity of the cut-ups through to some of the painting works. With the collages, it's more clear, but how do you get from the photographs he was doing and the collage work through to the paintings? How did that? What was his evolution?
I think that works in a number of ways. I think one is compositional, but I think the other is in this sort of, it's almost a basic principle of understanding that the cut-ups are, you know, sort of in two ways. Primarily, as Miles was saying earlier, about dislocation of language, and also about working through the effects of control, you know, and sort of offering a resistance to control. And I think that's the degree to which the sort of, on the one hand, you've got those works here that where the composition is akin to the way in which cut-ups might be presented, but without words, without something that can be read in that way. But I think the other side of this is, another way of attacking language is very much through the use of the particular gestural marks, glyph-like marks that are themselves rendered unreadable. And you know, even thinking about the folders, the file folders, which are containers of language, they're containers of stuff laid flat and then written over these sort of weird I can never say this word,
incantations.
exactly. Thank you. Incantatory. No, that's not how you say it. But anyway, but ultimately fairly meaningless. I mean, I've spent the last when I was here earlier, trying to read. It's pointless. But I think this sense of revealing something, this revealing of control, and offering, the cut of the Stanley knife through the mountain onto the newspapers underneath in the Beat Hotel when Brian Geisen did that, cutting his mount board. That slit offers a port of entry. Putting together, reading what is resulted offers another kind of port of entry, and I think it's exactly the same. It's like whether you're shooting at something, that's one kind of entry, and then you're reading it or not. And I think it's the same with all the other.
It's the same here, because a lot of these are basically different ways of producing a random effect that he can then work with. And he explored, as usual, every possible avenue. I mean, at one point he did drawings with gunpowder, just little sprinklings, and then set that on fire. But of course, there's not much left to exhibit. Whether that connects with Gustav Metzger or not, possibly, because Gustav is his.
I mean, I don't know. I mean,
but all that kind of thing.
I mean, I'm not sure how much at that point Gustav and Burroughs knew each other, but he certainly was. Burroughs with Ian Somerville was very, and I think Geisen was in the audience of one of the first lecture demonstrations in Cambridge at the Heritage Society. So, there are points of contact, most certainly. And Metzger was around. Yeah, in the mid-60s.
He may well have met him at the Indica Bookshop, actually.
They said they didn't really know each other, except for, I think it was Ian's first lecture that he sponsored at Cambridge, where Gustav presented autodestructive art, and Brian and William were in the audience. And then they went to dinner after, and William didn't say anything. It was one of those things. He didn't say anything.
Struck dumb.
Okay. Yeah, but it made a huge impression, that Gustav's lecture on autodestructive, and the flip side of that, which is very important, auto-creative art. Yeah. But I also wanted to say something that what you said, Andrew, just kind of sparked this off, is William's so-called divinatory practices. And he very much used visual art to do that. He was always looking for visual cues as to what the environment might be telling him, and what kind of intelligences or nature spirits or whatever might be speaking through to him. But he had a practice, I mentioned this the other day, where he made a glyph and then blotted it with another piece of paper, and then opened and read the two marks as Rorschach blots, but they were divination, and this idea of randomness, of chance, where you let the mice in, where you let the randomness in, is a way to disrupt and to go forward. Because if we don't go forward as the human race, racing forward, that then we're going to get the same old. So how do you change that trajectory? So that practice, which he included in his painting, is very much a part of this wayfinder.
Sure. Yeah. No. And I think the adoption of what seem on the face of it very kind of surrealist strategies, whether it's decalcomania or frottage or chance of one form or another, it's nothing to do with surrealism. It is just that these are processes that are available to anybody, and it's what you do with them and how you use them, in Burroughs' case, to actually find a way forward, keep moving, try and alter interpretation, see the world, present something that makes you see the world completely differently.
We always hear about how Burroughs and Geisen are on the same page, collaborating, but how do they differ? Where does Bill take things that Brian did not, do you think?
Well, Brian obviously came from a more of a fine art background, so pretty much when Brian was painting, I mean, he had an overall image in mind. He knew what he was trying to do. His hand was doing what his brain was telling it, and then he knew when to stop. And pretty much when Brian had finished the painting, that was it. The painting was done, and his next thing was to present it properly. Whereas with Bill, the painting was just the beginning of the process. I mean, once he had the picture there, that's when he would, examine it very, very carefully to see if the little devils were hiding in the corner, or whether he could find elements to photograph and blow up and carry it on into the next image. So, I mean, with Bill, it was a continuous process in a way, and he often worked in series in a way that Brian didn't. Although superficially, Brian's work is very similar, of course, but I mean, each Geisen, you can tell a Geisen is, just like that. Whereas with Bill, he didn't have a fine art background at all, and nor did he go to museums much. He didn't really know much about art, let's face it. He himself, we used to talk about that quite often. I mean, as far as he was concerned, he had some semblance of an idea of what he wanted to do, but he had to then set this in motion, even if he had to paint the picture with his eyes closed, which he did occasionally. But as soon as he'd done that, like killing the canvas, I suppose, I mean, once he got something down there, then he was in action. Then he could use a magnifying glass even, or we also have to remember, of course, that particularly with Bill, although sometimes quite often with Brian, I mean, a fair amount of drugs were involved here, so, in fact, pretty much the entire time of Burroughs' painting career, he would have been behind about 60 milligrams of methadone, and, of course, smoking dope the entire time. So that gave him an altered consciousness to begin with. Whereas Brian was a bit more systematic about that. I mean, he was more of an evening smoker, and I think more controlled and more aware of his position in art history. After all, I mean, Brian began as a surrealist, or was acclaimed by the surrealists as a surrealist, and Brian knew a lot of artists, and he knew the history of Western art in a way that Bill didn't. So there's quite big differences there. It's not that Bill was copying him, it's just that Bill used him as a bouncing off point and an intelligence to go back to, because Bill deferred very much to Brian. He was immensely respectful of Brian's work and Brian himself. So what we finish up with is a sort of raw talent almost, but with sort of almost random sort of influences coming in from elsewhere. So you can find a Burroughs that looks very similar to a Geisen, and then the next time you see something that's so far removed, you would never know that they knew each other. So I think by the time Bill got really going, which was after Brian was dead, he was on his own. He's on his own track, and the work developed accordingly, according to his interests, and then I suppose to a certain extent on what people said. I mean, he met other artists after all once he got going. Everybody from Rauschenberg to I forget who all they were, but
I mean, I think the other thing also really importantly, and it's sort of you've alluded to it, is the sense that Burroughs didn't. He wasn't constrained by tradition. He wasn't constrained by a learnt tradition. It was an activity. And that sort of as basic as that almost. It's like the shop paintings didn't come out because he wanted to do shop paintings. No. They came out of shooting practice. Yeah. He was testing a new gun. It wasn't anything more dramatic than that, really. And I think as he developed as an artist, he was he still remained completely unconstrained, unfettered. You know, it's like he could just do his activity. You know, sort of working through the methadone and substances.
Yes,
and that was sort
when
of
he was
it.
painting, he
Yeah.
was a painter,
Yeah.
and that was who he was. At
And
that
it was,
moment.
but he wasn't. But I think weirdly, and I think it's because it's also tied to a writing practice, and also the practice of you know, sort of generally being a writer / artist, is that I cannot see Burroughs as an untutored artist, even though he was. He isn't that. He doesn't give off that feeling of, oh, this is somebody who doesn't, it's coming from another place.
But I mean, Brian,
strange.
He was the only person that Brian Geisen allowed to watch him paint. I mean, so Bill would sit in the studio or room in the Beat Hotel watching Brian for hours and hours, and presumably they would talk. You know, and so. So he wasn't that naive, obviously. But by the time he was doing his own work, he had a fair background knowledge including Brian's knowledge of Japanese calligraphy and Arab calligraphy.
I mean, what he knew, he'd learned from Geisen as much. As
and then with other visiting artists.
Collage and photographic. So he did have decades of visual art practice.
For sure.
Exactly.
Any other questions?
Lots. Good.
Yeah, I'd be fascinated to know, to hear what either of you know, or just what you think about the picture directly behind you, the old assassin, because I think it's a remarkable thing. There's a couple of guns, there's some fetal heads, and there's a figure in it that could be Burroughs or could be a random person who looks doddery at the top, and who looks at the bottom like he's come from another world to abduct us.
I think that is Bill. Yeah.
Fantastic.
It looks. I mean, this relates very closely to the scrapbooks in its organisation, of course. So this is a sort of a good example of an intermediary. Although it was probably done about 89? I don't know. Is there a date on it? 89. Yeah. So it's an early one, and he's going back to his earlier practice that he did in the early 60s, but on a much bigger scale, and using much more of a fine art approach to the composition and the colour organisation and so on. I'm pretty sure I've seen these pictures before, and I think they are him, but I couldn't be sure about that. Yeah, I like that one.
Details of the wood where it's been shot. Oh, sorry, and the details of the wood where it's been shot, and these sort of spectral kind of figures. I mean, I think part of in any work like this, which includes an image of Burroughs in it, I think the question to be asked is it Burroughs? Who is that? Is it Burroughs? Which Burroughs kind of is it? Because so much of the time when he was making work, as I understand it, he was, part of the measures of success was to find something that was separate from himself, and it's almost like creating another and creating another. I mean, the sort of between the two figures is, there's lack of definition and even more crazily out of focus. And the way in which the gun, the pistols stand as a sort of surrogate person as well, and or a sort of a part of a person. It's a really complex thing, but it's also something that's kind of weirdly fixed in a way that the earlier photo montages, they're fixed in terms of the photograph that's taken, but the photographs that are the subjects of the collage, of the montage, are completely unfixed. This is done on a glass table in his place in Tangier or in Gibraltar, and I mean, some of them, they have this incredible layering because it's a glass coffee table. There's a map of Gibraltar underneath, and then photos that are of different people or different places, himself, friends, are moved around and snapped, and then moved around and snapped. And it's almost, sort of how interested was he in the fixity of the final image? Well, he wasn't at all, because, he didn't, it was the experience almost. It was almost that snapping. Yeah. And then it's gone. And it's like a spectre somehow, it's sort of will o' the wisp, there, not there.
So it's exactly this piece that I'm interested in. I think it's amazing, and I just wanted to. You said at one point he could make stuff with his eyes closed, or had no semblance of an idea. I just find it very difficult to think he didn't have a semblance of an idea of what he was doing in this piece here. And I wanted to link in with your point about when it's finished, because this would be if they moved it around, then when was this finished? I was really interested to think if anyone had any idea about his ideas about, is this one finished?
He didn't keep his eyes closed all the time, that's for sure, and he didn't just make work with his eyes closed.
The eyes closed ones were the ones where he was basically scrubbing at
but I think
at the card. Something like this is a much more conscious, organised piece.
But I think it's also, it is the result of moving things around to a sort of resolution.
I'm sure they were all
that's
in
how
different
colours.
places at some point.
Yeah. And then it's fixed with different paint, framed. The framing of the red, the treating the different pieces of paper, the images, as a sort of framing, but actually this is one image with what looks like a painting. Yeah. So it's sort of a painting within a painting, and there's sort of that sense of images that lead you further in, and you get to a point where there's a lack of definition, and the definition carries on falling away, and then suddenly you've got it, and it's like there's suddenly this other image comes up, and that's very much the case with the infinity collages, photomontages of the early 60s, where photographs are photographed and photographed and photographed until you get these kaleidoscopic images. And then you see something else. It's like in a lot of the more abstract work here, a lot of this is about finding a face. And it's not, it's someone other, and it's the self. But the self is always someone other anyway. So it's sort of that sense of play.
Hiya, so I'm just really interested if you could expand a bit more on Burroughs's these kind of personalities that he was playing throughout his life. I'm just wondering, did he ever kind of consider that as part of his artwork? Was it almost its own art form, I guess? Was it performance art even, to play all these different characters?
I think that was his entire life. He had all these different careers in a way, but in a sense, he was always a little removed. There was always this distance. He was always a couple of steps back. This is what made him quite difficult for people to, when they met him, because he was useless at small talk, obviously. And so he'd open the door and just stare at them, and then in the end they would go away. So it was, he just didn't know which role to play, basically. If he was with friends, it was a different matter. But even there, everything about Burroughs was fluid. I remember his 70th birthday in New York, for instance. All these different people were there. And some of them called him Willie. Some of them, Willie B, Bill, of course, William. He didn't even have the same name for most people. That was extraordinary, really. And some people, particularly who knew him much earlier on, had a very, very different view of what he was like as a person. Just trying to think. Well, anyway, Ginsberg, was a solid friend there all along, who said that Bill had changed enormously over the years and become more aware of his own creativity and developed a much more solid personality. Really, was less self-conscious, and more of a presence. But I think his only real core identity was as a creator. He knew he had something to say, and he was forever finding a different formula. I don't know. It's a difficult question, actually. Generally speaking, though, I mean, he from the very early days when he and Ginsberg and Kerouac and everybody were close friends in 44, 45 in New York, they would play games of charades and stuff, and he usually managed to break his identity down to about 8 different persons, from running right across the board. I mean, Oliver Harris has just done a little book called The One Shot, in which he analyzes an early photograph. It's the only photograph, in fact, showing Ginsberg, Burroughs, Kerouac, the big three. But even there, they're play acting in every photograph taken from that period. They're either acting out a sort of Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler kind of tough guy thing, or you never know which one's really Bill. Partly because he was homosexual and he was a junkie, and both could get him, land him in jail, basically. So he had to be as anonymous as possible, basically. And very early on, he in Chicago in 43, I guess it was, he tried to join a seminar that Krasipsky was doing, and he wrote an essay on Beau Brummel in order to get into this class. And of course, Beau Brummel's whole idea was that the perfectly dressed gentleman was so perfectly dressed that nobody noticed him at all. He was completely anonymous. And this was what Bill did throughout his life. He always fitted right in. When he was in Tangier, he'd be wearing a burnous and carrying a plastic bag with some oranges in it or something. And although he didn't look like a Moroccan, he certainly didn't look like a tourist. When he was living in London, he literally lived in St James's and dressed full Beau Brummel outfit. The fedora, the hat from Locks or Lobs or whichever it is, and the shoes and everything. He fitted perfectly. Nobody saw him at all. Out in Kansas, when I visited him out there a few times, he had a sort of MAGA kind of hat on, and blue jeans and a big baggy, farmer's outfit. Basically, he was a good old boy, and everybody took him for just some old farmer. Unless, of course, he was going into town to do a reading, in which case he had a suit on or something. It was always, in Tangier, the local boys always called him El Hombre Invisible, because that's what he was. And he used to practice trying to get from Brian Geison's restaurant back to where he lived without getting hustled. So see if he could do it completely invisibly. And he apparently managed it quite often.
So we have one last question.
Yeah, earlier in your excellent talk, you mentioned Burroughs and Bacon, and I think you were referencing chance and mistake, both preoccupations for both those artists. Would you like to speculate on the cultural origins of chance and mistake for Burroughs, apart from the firing range?
Mm-hmm. Okay, you're the art expert. It's that final flick of white paint that Bacon did.
As far as Bacon was concerned, and in that particular context, it was that kind of relying on something that would take you to the next, or the end stage, as it were, that would be the new beginning. I think in terms of where Burroughs found chance, I think it would be in terms of surrealist practice through Geisen. But if he really knew, if not that he knew, whether he knew or not, but whether he adopted chance consciously, or whether or not it was something that occurred as a result of the processes that he was following. And I think in terms of, Naked Lunch, which wasn't a cut-up book, but its editing certainly made it seem like one, to the cut-up trilogy that followed and all the experiments. I think, and how that, sort of what kick-started that, the Geisen cutting through the mount board onto the newspapers underneath and reading the results. I think it's one of the things I've always found very difficult when thinking about Burroughs is actually the value of making those kind of almost literal references make sense between, he got that from something, or he got that from somewhere else, or this person led him on to do that.
Yeah.
Because I kind of think actually it came out of something much more natural and not unaware, because he was a very aware person, but somehow he wasn't doing it necessarily in a knowing way. He was doing it because it fitted what he needed to do.
It was certainly, that's how he reached that stage, I think. But once he got there, he was definitely trying to cause chance effects. Shooting at spray cans, for instance. As he said, you have no way can you predict what the hell's going to happen.
I mean, when he shared the studio for a short time with Philip Taff, and they were, Philip Taff coming with great big spray cans, not to paint with, but to shoot at and explode and see what the result would be.
Yeah,
I think it's like he understands what the power of chance is, because it's something that unlocks stuff. It's not a strategy where you're constrained, although you can be constrained by chance. It was very much a release. It's kind of, let's see what happens. It's like Walter Probst with the giant cannonball. It's like, well, let's see what happens. Who knows? What could result?
Well, no, it is the ultimate extension of cut-ups. I mean, the whole point is to get a chance operation and see what happens. But because you don't use everything. I mean, with the cut-ups, it's a sort of myth that Burroughs just used whatever new formulation came up. Usually, it would take him. I mean, I've seen him at work. I mean, he would move the pieces for ages, and then eventually get one line that he would then type out on, and then move them again. So, it was using chance to get to that line. But in the end, it was a process of selection at work, which was very formal.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, there's that side of things. And then there's the way in which one can think of cut-ups as another form of bibliomancy. It is a sort of, you're divining something, and you're coming across something that you haven't read towards. It's come, it's arrived. It's like, how he always said, tomorrow's news today, and it's
future leaks through.
Yeah. So I think that sense of foretelling the now through the future, but I think it's that sense of seeing this as a giant form of divination, really.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
So that's good. From his boyhood, he was a boy that saw visions and hallucinations in every corner, and he continued through his life. Thank you so much. Thank you.